Another burst of wildfire smoke surges eastward out of the Canadian prairies, so they're not done with wildfire season. Many of us remember the devastating fires at Fort McMurray in 2016 and in Yellowknife in 2023. The summers up there getting to be problematic. The taiga forest full of spruce and pine, which has a high resin content, along with the blankets of fine needles, leaf litter, mosses, down trees. When all that dries out, it's a literal tinderbox. Right now, it's looking like most of that smoke will stay up in Canada. Some may drift into the Great Lakes area Saturday night and Sunday, and possibly later on into the Northeast. And we take a look at the surface map this afternoon. We've got a rather typical front through the eastern U.S. into the Central Plains, and we pick up another segment of that front through Wyoming, Idaho, and Oregon. This is being driven by a weak 1020 millibar high across the Great Lakes, another segment of that ridge up there in Saskatchewan, and just not very much in the way of high pressure up to the north, so that is limiting the southward spread of that smoke and the southward spread of the cold air. Down to the south, a stout tropical air mass, dew points in the 70s, and the dry line marking the westward extent of that tropical air. Some of it is filtering into the southwestern U.S., 50s dew points there, 57 at Phoenix this afternoon, and drying off into the 30s and 40s, but still some showers up there across the Great Basin region. The tropics looking quiet, nothing to report on the NHC products. As far as Invest 93L, the circulation very weak right there in southern Arkansas. Little precipitation filled with that, but it is pretty much gone. Earlier this week, some influencers on TikTok were forecasting a full-blown hurricane. You can see how those predictions went. That kind of media, not a good place to be getting severe weather information. When you get into second-guessing NHC forecasts, picking apart hurricane models, that is not something that's going to be in the wheelhouse of your average TikToker. It's difficult enough even for myself, which is why you probably noticed I'm very, very careful about straying from the official forecasts. And as you can see on the streamlines, a big old subtropical high across the western Gulf and a little bit of convergence right in here. Some of that is probably the remains of 93L. Across the northeastern U.S., typical summertime weather, afternoon temperatures in the 70s and 80s with the obligatory 90s in Virginia. Some storms popping up there, and we do have a slight risk of severe storms for much of central and southern Virginia, extending into northeastern North Carolina. The main threat is going to be gusty outflow winds. A large flood watch covers Virginia, West Virginia, southeastern Ohio, and eastern Kentucky. Another 1 to 1.5 inches of rain expected today on top of already saturated ground. Further west near Paducah and Cape Girardeau, we pick up a heat advisory for today, and in Wisconsin. In Oshkosh, the EAA AirVenture Air Show runs from Monday, July 21st through the 27th. Myself and this program have ties to the aviation community, so the air show is worth a mention. If anybody is out there going to that air show, drop a mention in the comments and we can continue to cover it next week. Officially, it starts on Monday, but the setup is going on right now. That air show started in 1953. It's become the biggest in the country with 500,000 attending. Wisconsin can definitely be problematic this time of year. Severe weather season shifts into the northern U.S. during the summer. Tornadoes, derechos, all that not unheard of. For this weekend, we're going to have some rain moving through, maybe starting overnight, and then one large MCS sometime tomorrow morning or during the afternoon. That'll pass through Oshkosh. We'll get some light and variable winds, and that'll be becoming northerly for Saturday night, and then a fair day for Sunday with high pressure up to the north. Northerly flow becoming easterly during the day. And then for Monday, the air show officially starts. That's a little bit out of the picture right now, but it looks like a storm system lurking to the southwest that could cause problems. The heat continues across the southeast, especially the Carolinas and Georgia, where we have mid-90s this afternoon. Again, a SPC slight risk in northeastern North Carolina into Virginia, and then a marginal risk extending across Kentucky, Tennessee, into the eastern Ozarks. Down to the south, air mass storms coalescing along this boundary right there and pushing northeast, and it appears there's just enough deep shear to allow a little bit of organization of those cells, but they will die off later this evening. The remains of 93L somewhere in Louisiana, Arkansas, maybe approaching the Arklatex. A flood watch is in effect for the North Carolina coast, basically up here. Another 2 to 4 inches of rain possible there. In Florida, heat advisory down through there. Southern Louisiana under a flood watch today, tonight, and Saturday due to that tropical disturbance being nearby. And that's going to be it for the southeast. In the southern plains, well, Arkansas and the Ozarks, they're going to be seeing a heat wave. In fact, this just came out earlier. They had the extreme heat warning for Little Rock for this weekend, but up here, that's going to run Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Heat indexes could be approaching 110. That includes Kansas City, Wichita, Springfield, Joplin, Branson, Jefferson City, and St. Louis. Quite a large area, and down to the south, heat advisories. Not much for Texas, a little bit more mild in that region, but still around DFW expecting mid to upper 90s, and it will get a little bit worse going into next week. For the northern plains, much cooler in northern Minnesota, highs in the 60s today. Yesterday, Bismarck, North Dakota dropped to 40, setting a record for the date. Dickinson dropped to 40. I think Dickinson is right there. They tied their record. Yesterday afternoon, Grand Island reached only 71 for a high. That was a record for the date. For today, 70s across Wisconsin, Iowa, into North Dakota, and 80s and 90s further south and west, including Montana. Today, we have a slight risk of severe storms. Let me put that up there. We are expecting a few supercells possible in Nebraska, parts of southeastern South Dakota. A few tornadoes are possible within this area. High wind and hail could also be a risk, and a large marginal risk extends all the way back into Wyoming and eastern Idaho. And it is hot in the Rockies, the eastern Colorado region, looking at 93 for Denver, 93 for Grand Junction, and 93 for Salt Lake City this afternoon. Wyoming and eastern Idaho all under a marginal risk of severe for today, mostly due to gusty outflow winds. In the southwestern U.S., monsoon pattern across the higher terrain. We have a flood watch in effect for the Sacramento Mountains from Rio Doso northwards, heavy rainfall rates in some of those storms. Some of those showers and storms all the way back into Utah, into the Las Vegas area, Mount Charleston, and even as far as Interstate 15 around Death Valley Road. They had a flood advisory earlier this afternoon. In the desert southwest, near seasonal normals, temperatures in the mid-100s, and in the San Joaquin Valley, mostly 90s for this afternoon. 76 for downtown LA, and I can see some storms going up on the mountains just north of Riverside. And for the northwestern U.S., cool at Seattle with 73 for a high, 85 at Portland. However, there is some cold advection going on, dropping those temperatures very gradually. Mid-90s in the Columbia River Basin, 98 for Boise. Red flag warnings in effect for the Washington interior for today and north central Oregon due to west winds gusting to 35 miles an hour and relative humidity down to 10%. And then heading into the Pacific, a strong North Pacific high, 1032 millibars. Sometimes we do see it up near 1036 to 1042 millibars. It can get quite strong. Alaska, temperatures near seasonal normals up to 70 at Fairbanks and looks like 60 at Anchorage. Some cool air working down through the Mackenzie River Delta into the North Slope area. Temperatures close to seasonal normals, about 35 right there on the Arctic Ocean coast. Dropping south into British Columbia, There is an area of disturbed weather from about Prince George down to Vancouver, showers and storms all through the Fraser Valley. And we did have some lightning strikes out around Smithers and Fraser Lake west of Prince George. There is a lot of smoke up there in the Northwest Territories. They have wildfire smoke warnings, including Yellowknife, along with a heat warning for that same area. They were expecting 86 around Yellowknife, but it appears that is cooling down. In Alberta, a severe thunderstorm watch posted from Calgary along the foothills of the Rockies. Across the prairies, extensive wildfire smoke warnings from Fort McMurray into central Manitoba, and then we have advisories in western Ontario. In the Maritimes, heat warning for eastern Newfoundland today. Temperatures up to 82 around Gander. Rainfall warning further north around Goose Bay due to this strong frontal system and the influx of tropical moisture. Look at those dew points right there, 64 to 72. That's similar to Texas. And speaking of moisture in Texas and the South and all that, let's look at the precipitable water. This is a measure of how much moisture there is in the atmosphere in a vertical column. This is not an estimate of precipitation. It's more of a measure of the total moisture available. So, yeah, quite a bit down there in the deep south, up to 2.5 inches. This is the remnants of 93L down there. And gradually some of it gets carried into the central Ohio Valley, and doubtless that is pushing up those heat indexes in Arkansas and the Ozarks. So there is a tie to that extreme heat warning and the remains of that tropical disturbance. And heading into the extended, plenty of available moisture, especially in the Ohio River Valley, the southeast, 2 to 2.5 inches in some areas, and just more of the same for next week. A little bit of drying in Texas, maybe, down to 1 to 1.5, maybe a little bit of flow off of the Mexican plateau there, but overall looks like a very typical July pattern. Oh, here's another surge coming up in the Gulf Coast region for the end of next week. That could be maybe a tropical depression heading into Texas right there, or just could be a surge of tropical moisture. Anyway, we need to look at other charts to really know what's going on. In the Southwest, they do things a little bit differently there. Different kind of chart. Dew point, the 700 millibar flow, indicated by the vectors right there, and that gives us an idea of the monsoon behavior. In addition, we've got the precipitation plots right there. That's a bit of a cheat sheet. So for this evening, this is running a little bit drier than the actual observed values, 51 at Phoenix, 50 at Tucson, and we tend to more focus on the trends than the absolute values. And we do see it dries off a little bit overnight into tomorrow, so maybe some subsidence working on the air mass. We are still holding on to 50s in this little plume up there along the Continental Divide through Saturday, and some of it builds back north, kind of sloshing around there across the border through the weekend, and then we pick up back into the 50s for early next week. So it looks like a fairly stable pattern, although, what's this 320 right here? I don't have the lows and highs actually plotted on here, so we have to kind of look at the surrounding field. And that is a clockwise rotation, which indicates the presence of a high pressure area or a subtropical high at 700 millibars. So that right there, that's helping to suppress the moisture to some extent. To really bring in that tropical moisture, we want to see that whole ridge complex back off towards the east, and that allows the southerly flow in from Old Mexico. So we're not quite at that right now. Just a little smidge of southerly flow into the southern border areas, and just enough to bring things up to the 60s by late next week. So that's kind of how things look on the GFS. And probably towards the end, we're starting to get a little bit more of that southerly flow, but that's still pretty far off. And we go up to 500 millibars, the mid-troposphere, about 18,000 feet. A very large subtropical high across the southeastern U.S. Also, this persistent Hudson Bay vortex, both of those synergistically combine to produce this gate of west to east flow. So that gives us a very progressive pattern across the northern tier states, ushering in these troughs and these ridges one by one. They just kind of march through like a big parade. A cutoff low off of the Southern California coast, that's partly responsible for those showers and storms in the California desert. So we go into the weekend and see how things look. Not really much change. This little trough right there in the northwestern U.S. that becomes dominant in that part of the country, our cutoff low goes away. And towards the middle of the week, yeah, it's much the same. In fact, I would say this subtropical high starts really building across the deep south and the Ozarks and Arkansas. So that spells a heat wave. And typically when you get these really strong ridges across the central U.S. and the southeast, that does allow the southerly flow to strengthen a little bit in Arizona. That can be conducive to rains in Arizona when we get those heat waves out to the east. So that's one thing you want to be looking for during the summertime. So towards the very end, big old ridge right there. But it hasn't quite broken down that ridge across Arizona, so a very stubborn weather pattern. And they may get some relief there towards the very end as this big old high sets up, and you can see that southeasterly flow opening up into the desert southwest. And meanwhile, in the central U.S., that spells a lot of hot weather for Chicago, Kansas City, the Ozarks, all of that. All right, let's go ahead and check out our forecast. Here's that nearly stationary frontal boundary, just waves working along it. The first one will cross Minnesota and Iowa tonight and move into Wisconsin and Illinois for early tomorrow. There is a slight risk for severe across eastern Iowa, across the southern Great Lakes, and northern Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. There could be an isolated tornado within that, but the main hazard, high wind and hail. In the Great Plains, we see 100s breaking out from Wichita Falls to Altus up to Russell. A slight risk in effect along this frontal boundary in Nebraska. Let me bring that up to peak heating right there. There's a storm near Ogallala. That's just west of North Platte. There could be some high wind and hail within that and an outside risk of a tornado. Monsoon rains on the higher terrain of the southern Rockies, very little in the valleys, and remaining in the 100s in the southwest deserts, 75 to 80 for Seattle and Portland. Then for Sunday, continued stormy from Chicago to Des Moines and Sioux Falls. Stagnant across much of the country, 100s continue in the central U.S. into the Ozarks, 101 for Salina. I'm not going to say they may not have 100s in the Ozarks, but it will be awfully close. So I'm going to leave it at that. Very large marginal risk across the northeast corridor into much of the Ohio River Valley and up that frontal boundary. The main threat right there, hail, high winds, and an outside chance of a tornado. So there we go for Sunday night and then on into Monday. Much cooler in New England with strong cold advection. Then for Tuesday, things heating back up there in the northeastern U.S. Heat wave continues in the central U.S. with that big upper-level high in place, and that'll be a very persistent pattern. This is a little bit reminiscent of the 1995 heat wave that affected Chicago. It probably doesn't have that same sort of intensity and northward strength, but it is a very similar pattern to what happened back then 30 years ago. In fact, there's probably going to be some people talking about that since it is the 30th anniversary. In fact, right now, the 18th, it's just a week past that 30-year anniversary. All right, the rest of the sequence right there, just continued monsoon flow across the Continental Divide area up into Utah and Colorado, storms every afternoon. This is almost a semi-permanent feature right there from the Midwest, the Northeast corridor up to the Northern Plains. And the rest of us in the U.S. just, more of the same. And let's take a quick look at Canada. I'm not really going to go over this, but you can focus on your favorite area. A big blob of cold air coming out of the western Arctic that sinks into the prairies for the start of next week. and some of that coming down into the northern U.S., but the majority of it heading into Hudson Bay due to that very progressive west to east flow. There's another wave coming out of the North Pacific, crossing the western prairies for late next week. Definitely some influence right there, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, but not so much for the northern plains. They're still under southwesterly flow near the end of the period. Only at the very end, July 27th, do they pick up some of that northerly flow. And here's another one on the way. All right, so that is it for the forecast. In closing, a special thanks to John Hillary out in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, who sent in a nice little boost for the program. This is greatly appreciated. Some people watch the show for free. Others, like John, invest in the program by taking the time to write out a check or logging into Patreon, and there's the link for that. That's the kind of thing that helps me set aside more time for the show, and it's a morale boost, knowing that there's folks out there who believe in the program. And if you're unable to support the program, I understand, but you can help spread the word on social media. That will be a great help. All right, we'll be back on Monday for the special private supporter edition, and on Tuesday for the regular program. Hope you have a great weekend. Bye-bye.